Welcome to the Boring Files Saga, the only series brave enough to spend your bedtime hours explaining things no one has ever asked about. Tonight's subject is drinking in medieval times, a time before water filters, soda machines, or anything resembling a coffee shop. Back then, a reliable drink was anything that wouldn't make you ill within the hour, which left most people reaching for ale. Now, in case you were hoping for gallant knights slamming mugs together or taverns filled with adventurous merriment, let me lower your expectations quickly. Most medieval drinking was not epic, it was routine. Mild ale with bread, more ale with lunch, perhaps a little more ale with supper, occasionally wine, if you were wealthy or lived in the right region, mead if you happened to know a beekeeper, cider if you had apples. Different drinks existed, but the real excitement was that people kept finding new ways to make the same day slightly less thirsty. And because this is YouTube, I should ask you to like and subscribe. Think of it like a medieval tavern tab. Once you sign your name, you're technically committed to return, even if you'd rather not. Over the course of this narration, we'll be exploring what people actually drank, how it was made, and the places where it was consumed. We'll also cover the less romantic realities, sour barrels, suspicious additives, and the uncomfortable truth that even children were expected to down a pint at breakfast. So pour yourself something modern and safe, because we're about to step into a world where staying hydrated meant drinking your way through several gallons of ale every week. And with that, we begin at the medieval breakfast table. Ale was not an indulgence in medieval times. It was the baseline of existence, brewed in homes, monasteries, and towns alike. The logic was practical. Water might look clear enough in a cup, but it often carried invisible risks. Wells could be contaminated, rivers doubled as both washing stations and waste dumps, and ponds were generally better suited for livestock than for pouring into a glass. People didn't need microscopes to figure this out. They just noticed who fell ill after drinking water and decided it was safer to boil some grain instead. That process, boiling, fermenting, and storing, produced ale. Not the strong, frothy drink romanticized in modern pubs, but a weaker, everyday version. It provided hydration, calories, and a faint sense of cheerfulness without knocking anyone off their stool. A ploughman could down several pints during a long day in the fields and still hold the plough straight. Monks could consume their allotted share without disrupting the chanting schedule, though one imagines a slightly more enthusiastic rendition of evening prayers after a few rounds. Children, too, were part of the system. They drank what was called small beer, which was essentially ale with most of its ambition boiled out of it. It kept them hydrated, filled their stomachs, and reassured parents that the household supply wasn't being wasted on something as reckless as plain water. In modern terms, it was the medieval version of being handed a flat soda at a party, technically a drink, but not one anyone bragged about. The truth is, ale was food as much as drink. Brewing captured the energy of grains and turned it into liquid calories. Alongside bread, it formed the backbone of the medieval diet, carrying people through labor-intensive days. Chroniclers barely mentioned it because there was nothing remarkable about it. To say ale was consumed would have been like writing people breathed air. It was the assumption, the backdrop, the unspoken constant. What did catch attention was when ale was missing, when harvests failed, when fermentation spoiled, or when landlords hoarded barrels. The absence of ale was considered a crisis. Its presence, on the other hand, was so ordinary that it slipped beneath notice. And so, the rhythm of medieval life began not with coffee, tea, or juice, but with ale, a drink that kept peasants in the fields, monks in the cloisters, and children at the table, even if it left a layer of sediment at the bottom of every mug. Which brings us quite naturally to the medieval breakfast. If ale was the foundation of medieval life, breakfast was the most reliable place to find it waiting. The day began with ale on the table, as ordinary as bread or porridge. In fact, it was so routine that no one remarked on it. To medieval people, starting the morning with beer wasn't unusual, it was expected. A modern visitor might find the idea shocking. The image of a 10-year-old drinking a pint at sunrise tends to cause raised eyebrows today. But to them, it was simply breakfast. This morning drink was almost always the weaker version of ale, what we would call small beer. Its alcohol content was low, often just enough to preserve it and keep harmful microbes from multiplying. The goal was not to stagger through chores before noon, but to provide hydration and a little energy to face the day. Labourers needed the calories, children needed something safe to drink, and even the household's elders expected their mug to be filled before conversation began. Coffee would not appear in Europe for centuries, tea even later, and orange juice was as exotic as flying carpets. Ale was the default. The morning pint also served as a kind of insurance policy. A worker who had ale in his belly at dawn was less likely to faint in the field by mid-morning. It gave just enough sustenance to bridge the gap between breakfast and the heavier meals later in the day. Monastic rules often allotted specific rations for each part of the day, and breakfast ale was not negotiable. One Benedictine order specified that monks were allowed a certain number of pints daily, carefully measured out, though whether every monk observed the limits strictly is another matter. One imagines that the divine office of prayer sounded considerably more enthusiastic if someone's measuring jug had been filled a little too generously. Even nobles, who had the option of imported wines and richer foods, began the morning with ale. It might be served in finer vessels, perhaps flavoured with spices, but it was still ale at its core. The social class difference was not in the choice of drink, but in the quality and the quantity. A lord's breakfast might include stronger brew and better bread, while the peasants managed with weaker ale and coarser loaves. The ritual, however, was the same across the spectrum. The day did not start until ale was poured. There is also evidence that morning drinking carried a social element. Households gathered at the table before scattering to fields, workshops, or markets. A shared mug of ale was as much about community as sustenance. Neighbours might stop in, not for gossip or feasting, but simply because their own brewing was delayed, and it was understood that borrowing a mug at dawn was a perfectly normal request. In this way, ale moved not only through bodies, but through villages, circulating as freely as news of the weather or the latest tax complaint. The taste, of course, was not something to write home about, though to be fair, few medieval peasants were writing home. Small beer in the morning was often thin, with sediment swirling at the bottom of the cup. It could be sour if the brewing had gone poorly, or unexpectedly sweet if someone misjudged the malt. These variations were tolerated with stoic indifference. Complaining about breakfast beer was rather like complaining about the sunrise. No one was going to change it for you. Modern ears may find it strange to picture an entire society starting the day with alcohol, but in context, this was not about indulgence. It was about practicality. Ale was safer than water, more filling than plain grain, and familiar enough that it required no ceremony. You drank it because it was there, and because everyone else did. And if it left you slightly more cheerful as you headed out to plough a field, or pray in a chapel, or nag your apprentices, that was simply a bonus. Thus, the morning beer set the tone for the entire day, not a drunken haze, but a steady hum of mild fortification, a rhythm of life so ingrained that no one thought to question it, which leads naturally to a deeper question. If mornings were powered by ale, how did people distinguish between weak everyday drink and the stronger versions reserved for special use? Morning beer was mild by design, but not every mug in medieval times was brewed to the same weakness. Ale existed on a sliding scale, with one end intended to quench thirst without consequence, and the other meant to leave drinkers a little unsteady in their shoes. The distinction between small beer and strong ale was one of purpose as much as process. One kept people moving through their daily routines, the other made festivals livelier, negotiations bolder, and sermons harder to follow. The difference began in the brewhouse. When grains were mashed with hot water, the first liquid drained off carried the highest concentration of sugars. Fermented, this became strong ale, rich, potent, and closer to what a modern drinker would recognize as real beer. After that, the same grains were soaked again, and sometimes again after that, each run producing a weaker liquid. By the third or fourth round, the result was thin, lightly fermented, and barely alcoholic. This was the small beer that filled breakfast tables and workday mugs. A useful comparison might be a tea bag. The first steeping is strong, the second still drinkable, the third mainly hot water with ambition. Strong ale was prized, but not practical for everyday use. It required more grain, more effort, and more careful management to avoid waste. As a result, it was brewed less frequently, served more selectively, and consumed with the awareness that it could actually impair the drinker. In households with limited resources, strong ale was a luxury, often saved for guests or important occasions. Small beer, by contrast, was brewed in far greater volume. Its role was not celebration but sustenance, a background presence rather than a centerpiece. Social expectations reflected these differences. A laborer who drank small beer throughout the day was considered responsible, even healthy. A laborer who drank strong ale before noon was considered either lucky to have found it or foolish for attempting to work afterward. Nobles and clergy had more freedom to indulge, but even among them, strong ale was not an everyday staple. Its strength made it noticeable, and in a society where nearly everyone was drinking something all the time, being noticed for your drinking was rarely flattering. The flavours differed as well, though neither category would win awards in a modern brewery competition. Strong ale tended to be malty, heavy, and prone to spoilage if left too long. Small beer was thin, often sour, and sometimes so weak that people debated whether it deserved the name beer at all. But drinkers were not connoisseurs by modern standards. The question was less, does this taste good? And more, will this get me through the day without illness? By that measure, both small beer and strong ale performed adequately, if not delightfully. One curious aspect of this divide is how normal it seemed to children. They grew up knowing that their cup would always hold the weakest version, while their parents might have access to something stronger at special times. It was an unspoken rule of family life. The young and the poor drank small beer, while the privileged or the fortunate had the option of something richer. This quiet hierarchy of strength mirrored the broader hierarchies of medieval society, clear, unquestioned, and rarely challenged. Thus, while small beer was the constant, strong ale marked the exceptions. It was the drink of feasts, gatherings, and moments when people wanted more than hydration. It also carried the risk of overindulgence, a problem that worried clergy and lawmakers alike. For if small beer kept society steady, strong ale was the thing most likely to push it off balance. Which leads naturally to another question. In a world where even the youngest were drinking ale, how exactly did children fit into this culture of constant consumption? Strong ale marked special occasions, but small beer was so mild that even children were expected to drink it. To modern ears, this sounds reckless, the kind of thing that would lead to a swift visit from social services. In medieval times, it was nothing remarkable. Children drank ale because there was nothing else to drink that was both safe and available in large quantities. Milk soured quickly, clean water was unreliable, juice in the sense of squeezing fruit for refreshment was impractical when fruit was a seasonal luxury. What was left was the weakest run of ale, poured into small mugs and handed over without ceremony. Records don't dwell on this fact, which suggests it was uncontroversial. Chroniclers, when they bothered to describe daily life, mentioned children playing, learning trades, or attending church, but rarely paused to say, and they were drinking small beer at the time. It was assumed, in the same way modern writers don't feel compelled to note, that children drink water with dinner. The exception was when children lacked access to ale altogether, which was seen as a sign of hardship. If a family couldn't provide even the weakest beer, something was deeply wrong. The nutritional role of small beer mattered here. Children needed calories, and liquid bread was a convenient way to provide them. Small beer contained remnants of grain sugars, trace minerals, and enough liquid volume to keep thirst at bay. It was closer to a thin porridge in its usefulness than to a modern beer in its effect. A mug at breakfast might be followed by another at midday, and perhaps another in the evening. Few questioned the practice because few had alternatives. That isn't to say there were no side effects. A particularly strong batch might leave younger drinkers more cheerful than their parents intended. Stories of rowdy children are not plentiful, but one can imagine a feast where the youngest members of a household were livelier than usual after a few generous refills. Most of the time, though, the drink was too weak to matter. The biggest complaint was not drunkenness, but taste, sourness, thinness, or the sediment that settled at the bottom. Medieval parents likely developed the same skill modern parents employ when insisting their children finish their greens, encouraging the last swallow while ignoring grimaces. In wealthier households, children sometimes had access to alternatives. Diluted wine could appear at the table, especially in regions where vineyards were common. Even then, the principle was the same. The beverage was lightly alcoholic, not intended to intoxicate, but to prevent illness and to supplement the diet. The difference was in cost and availability. For the majority, small beer was the only option. The church took little issue with the practice, which is telling. Clergy railed against drunkenness in sermons and official decrees, but rarely against children drinking ale. The assumption was that moderation was possible, and that the weakness of the beverage made it harmless. One suspects that practical experience played a role here. Even priests had been raised on the same drink from childhood. To condemn it would be to condemn their own upbringing. To modern audiences, the sight of children drinking beer might seem shocking. In medieval times, it was simply part of the rhythm of life. Children didn't toast, they didn't drink for pleasure, and they weren't sneaking pints in barns. They drank small beer because their parents handed it to them, and because it was as ordinary as bread. It was not a matter of choice, but of necessity. And yet, the sheer volume of ale consumed by all ages is difficult to imagine. Records suggest daily consumption rates that would stagger a modern drinker, not in strength, but in quantity, which brings us to the remarkable numbers that defined medieval drinking habits. The most striking detail about drinking in medieval times is not just that everyone, including children, consumed ale. It is how much of it they consumed. Surviving records, accounts, and monastic rules suggest quantities that sound absurd to modern ears. Estimates vary by region and by source, but a figure that recurs with suspicious confidence is roughly a gallon per adult per day. To put that into perspective, that is about 8 modern pints. Enough to horrify a doctor at an annual physical, but considered perfectly ordinary for a medieval farmer. Some of these estimates come from household records, where the daily ration of ale was measured out with other provisions like bread and cheese. In monasteries, regulations often spelled out precise allowances. So many pints per monk per day, to be consumed with meals or distributed throughout the hours of labour and prayer. The idea of carefully rationing beer to men devoted to vows of silence and humility may seem contradictory, but the logic was practical. Food and drink had to be accounted for, and beer was both. Of course, there is reason to be cautious with these numbers. Medieval chroniclers were not statisticians. When a record states that a man drank 3 gallons of ale in a single day, it is possible he did. It is also possible the scribe exaggerated, or counted multiple people in one figure, or simply felt the need to make the story sound more impressive. Even so, when so many sources agree that consumption was high, the broad conclusion is difficult to escape. Medieval people drank more ale than most modern people would consider feasible. The explanation lies in strength. As discussed earlier, small beer was weak, often no stronger than 1 or 2% alcohol by volume. It was closer to liquid bread than to modern craft beer. A gallon of it was filling, yes, but not incapacitating. A farm labourer who spent the day ploughing, sowing or harvesting could easily burn off the calories and remain functional, if not particularly cheerful about the flavour. Strong ale, by contrast, was consumed in much smaller amounts and only on special occasions. So while the numbers sound staggering, they were spread across a liquid that was more nourishment than intoxication. Still, even small beer added up. A medieval household needed to brew constantly to meet the demand. Barrels were drained and refilled on a regular cycle, with careful planning to ensure that no one went dry. For peasants, running out of ale was not just inconvenient, but disruptive to daily life. For monasteries, it would have been considered poor management. For nobles, it would have been embarrassing at best and politically damaging at worst. Hospitality was judged in large part by the availability of drink. Humour creeps in when considering how casually these numbers were treated. A medieval monk might be allotted 2 or 3 quarts of ale per day by rule, with the understanding that some days called for more. A peasant family might record consumption that, when converted into modern terms, suggests each member of the household was constantly carrying a mug. Whether the actual intake matched these records or not, the point is clear. Ale was consumed in amounts that today would leave an office worker unconscious at their desk before lunch. And yet, no one seemed to find this remarkable. It was the expected rhythm of life. The only time volume was noted specifically was when something went wrong, a shortage, a spoiled batch, or a dispute over taxes measured in barrels rather than coins. Otherwise, the sheer gallons disappeared into the background, as invisible to chroniclers as the daily act of breathing. This dependence on constant brewing raises an obvious question. Who was responsible for producing all this ale, and how was the burden managed in societies where nearly every household depended on it? Keeping up with the daily demand for ale meant that nearly every household was, in some sense, a brewery. Brewing was not a specialized craft in its earliest forms, but a domestic task, as ordinary as baking bread or tending livestock. A medieval home might brew a fresh batch every few days, cycling barrels so that there was always something fermenting, something ready to drink, and something being consumed. Without this rhythm, the family's supply would run out, and with it the ability to quench thirst safely. The responsibility for this work most often fell to women. The figure of the alewife, a woman who brewed for her household and occasionally sold the surplus to neighbours, was common across villages. Her work involved hauling water, heating it, steeping grains, and carefully watching the fermentation process. No thermometers, no timers, just experience and instinct. It was labour-intensive, but it also provided one of the few ways women could earn income directly, since excess ale could be sold or bartered. The scale was small, but the expectations were high. A poorly brewed batch risked sourness, infection, or explosions if the barrel swelled beyond what the hoops could contain. Households developed tricks to manage these risks: herbs for flavour, clay pots for storage, and a certain tolerance for unexpected results. After all, a slightly sour drink was still safer than water. Complaints were rare, unless the ale was truly undrinkable, at which point neighbours might mutter about whether the brewer had been distracted, or worse, whether she had tried to stretch the grain too far. Domestic brewing also varied by season. In colder months, fermentation was slower and storage easier. In summer, heat made brewing more precarious, with spoilage more likely if barrels were left too long. Households had to plan carefully, brewing enough to keep supply steady, but not so much that it spoiled before being consumed. The stakes were high enough that brewing failures could disrupt daily life, leading to disputes, shortages, or long treks to buy ale elsewhere. For many families, brewing was part of a cycle of chores that blended seamlessly with other work. Grain grown in the fields was milled, some for bread, some for beer. Leftover grains from brewing, known as draff, fed animals, closing the loop in a way modern sustainability advocates would admire. The process was practical, economical, and nearly invisible to those who lived within it. To them, brewing was not a craft hobby or a weekend indulgence. It was survival, poured into a cup 3 times a day. The sheer ordinariness of household brewing is perhaps what makes it so remarkable in hindsight. No one celebrated the alewife who produced a decent, unremarkable batch. Success was measured in silence. No illness, no spoilage, no empty barrels before the next batch was ready. Only failure drew attention, sometimes in the form of fines if the ale was sold and judged unfit, sometimes in the form of whispered complaints over sour mugs. One could say medieval brewers pioneered the principle of customer feedback, though in their case the reviews were mostly muttered in the street. Yet while many households brewed for themselves, some women found opportunity in brewing for others. A surplus could be sold, and if demand was high enough, brewing shifted from household necessity to commercial venture. This blurred the line between private consumption and public supply, giving rise to the figure who became central to medieval drinking culture. The alewife not just as domestic worker, but as entrepreneur. Household brewing kept families supplied, but it also opened the door to a more public role, the alewife. In many villages, women who mastered the craft of brewing not only provided for their households, but also brewed surplus to sell. This made them one of the most visible figures in medieval drinking culture, standing at the intersection of domestic work and local commerce. The alewife was as familiar a presence in the community as the baker or the miller, and in some cases even more talked about. Running an ale business required more than skill with grain and yeast. It meant dealing with regulation, taxes and neighbours who were quick to complain if the drink was too weak or too sour. Authorities often imposed standards, not because they cared deeply about quality, but because they cared about revenue. Taxes were levied on ale, and the alewife who skirted these obligations risked fines, public shaming, or worse. The church also took an interest, alternately scolding alewives for greed or praising them when they donated to pious causes. The work itself was demanding. Brewing in bulk meant hauling larger quantities of water, managing more fuel for heating, and lifting heavy vessels that would have exhausted anyone not used to manual labour. Alewives often turned their homes into makeshift taverns, serving mugs to villagers who preferred not to brew themselves. These spaces were small, smoky, and far less romantic than later depictions of medieval inns. For most customers, the goal was not a cheerful gathering, but a reliable drink, and the alewife's reputation rose or fell with the consistency of her barrels. Humour enters the picture when we consider the image of alewives in medieval satire. They were common targets in songs and poems, often accused of watering down their ale, shorting measures, or being overly sharp with customers. One popular theme was the idea that alewives kept two sets of measures, a full one for neighbours they liked, and a smaller one for those who had annoyed them. Whether this was true or simply a way for frustrated customers to explain a light pour is difficult to know. Either way, it suggests that complaining about your bartender has a long and noble history. Despite the jokes, alewives played a vital role in sustaining their communities. They turned a household chore into a trade, one of the few economic opportunities available to women that was socially acceptable, if sometimes morally suspect, in the eyes of preachers. For poorer households, selling ale could mean the difference between scraping by and having a modest income. For wealthier ones, it could be a way of consolidating influence, since the person who controlled the drink controlled much of the village's goodwill. Their work also connected directly to broader patterns of production. A good alewife needed grain from the local fields, fuel from woodcutters, and vessels from coopers and potters. In this way, a single barrel of beer represented the labour of an entire community, brought together in one frothy, occasionally sour mug. The figure of the alewife thus stands not just for a woman selling beer, but for the network of medieval life that supported her trade. And while complaints about sour ale were plentiful, customers kept returning. The alternative, brewing at home every few days with the risk of failure, was far less appealing to many. The convenience of buying a jug from an experienced alewife outweighed the occasional grumble about taste or price. From these women came much of the knowledge of brewing that filtered into larger, more organized production. To understand how ale truly made its way from grain to mug, we turn next to the brewing process itself, the careful steps, approximations, and occasional accidents that produce the defining drink of medieval times. Once alewives and households decided to brew, the real work began. Brewing in medieval times was neither glamorous nor especially precise. It was a routine of steps carried out with more instinct than measurement, producing a drink that was dependable enough to keep people alive, but rarely identical from batch to batch. The process began with grain, usually barley, though oats, rye, and wheat appeared when circumstances demanded it. The grains were malted, soaked in water until they sprouted slightly, then dried to halt the growth. This stage unlocked the sugars that fermentation would later transform into alcohol. The malted grain was then mashed. Hot water was poured over it, extracting sugars into a sweet liquid known as wort. Without thermometers, brewers judged heat by touch or by observing the rising steam. If it burned your hand, it was too hot. If it felt like bath water, it was probably acceptable. Once the wort had been collected, it was boiled, which not only concentrated the sugars, but also helped kill off microbes. Given the general medieval understanding of cleanliness, this boiling step was one of the few safety measures they got right by accident. After boiling, the wort was cooled and transferred into wooden vats, where yeast, sometimes deliberately reused, sometimes carried by the air, began its work. Fermentation could take several days, during which the ale bubbled, foamed, and occasionally spilled over the edges of its container. Brewers listened for the hiss of fermentation, sniffed for the right aromas, and learned through trial and error when a batch was ready to drink. Timers were unnecessary. The ale itself provided its own impatient signals. The finished drink was then drawn into jugs, casks, or barrels. At this point, its character was largely set. It might be strong and malty, or thin and sour, depending on the quality of the grain and the luck of the fermentation. Medieval brewers accepted this variability with resigned indifference. Ale was not judged against a standard recipe, but against whether it was drinkable and available. Humour inevitably creeps in when imagining this process. A brewer standing over a steaming vat, deciding readiness by dipping in a finger, was not practicing artisanal craft so much as educated guessing. Yeast, invisible and mysterious, was treated with the respect of a temperamental houseguest. Some brewers swore by rituals, convinced that speaking kindly to a barrel improved the results. Others may simply have prayed that this week's ale would not sour before the neighbours finished buying it. Despite the unpredictability, the steps were consistent enough to form the backbone of medieval brewing. Each household and alewife added their own variations, but the structure was the same. Malt the grain, mash it, boil the wort, let it ferment, and hope for the best. From this unpolished process came the drink that sustained villages, filled taverns, and set the rhythm of medieval life. Brewing, however, did not take place in a vacuum. The seasons imposed their own challenges, shaping when and how ale could be made. And with the turn of the year came the delicate balance between brewing enough to last and brewing so much that spoilage ruined the supply. Brewing ale was never a one-size-fits-all operation. The time of year dictated nearly everything about the process, from how long fermentation might take to whether the drink would keep for more than a few days. Seasonal brewing was less about preference and more about survival in medieval times. Cold months favoured the brewer, while summer turned every barrel into a gamble. Winter provided the most reliable conditions. Low temperatures slowed fermentation, allowing the ale to develop steadily without spoiling too quickly. Barrels stored in cool cellars or outbuildings might keep their contents for weeks, sometimes even months, if the brewer was lucky. Brewing in winter also meant fewer pests. Flies, mold, and other unwelcome visitors had less chance of interfering. A careful household could brew in large batches, confident the ale would last until the next round was ready. Summer was another story. Heat accelerated fermentation, sometimes so quickly that the brewer lost control of the process. What should have been ale could turn sour within days, forcing households to brew in smaller, more frequent batches. The increased workload was frustrating, but there was little alternative. Drinking spoiled beer was unpleasant at best and dangerous at worst. Complaints about sour ale became more common in summer, though it is doubtful anyone stopped drinking because of it. More likely they sighed, grumbled about fate, and took another sip. Spring and autumn fell somewhere in between, offering conditions that were workable but still unpredictable. Spring brewing risked contamination as temperatures rose and insects returned. Autumn brought the advantage of fresh grain from harvest, but also the pressure of brewing before the chill set in. Timing mattered, and households that misjudged the season's turn might find themselves with barrels that didn't last as long as they had hoped. The seasonal rhythm also influenced flavour. Winter ales tended to be stronger, made with the intention of lasting through the cold months. Summer ales were weaker and more perishable, brewed quickly and consumed quickly. This pattern wasn't a matter of culinary design so much as necessity. Medieval people did not sit around debating tasting notes. They drank whatever the season made possible. There was, however, room for superstition. Some brewers swore that brewing on certain days produced better results, while others believed the weather itself carried omens for success or failure. A sudden storm during fermentation might be taken as a bad sign. Too much sun, equally so. Whether these beliefs improved the beer is doubtful, but they provided explanations when barrels went bad, which happened often enough to warrant excuses. Humour emerges when you picture the brewer's frustration. Imagine hauling grain, drawing water, tending a fire, and waiting days for fermentation, only to discover that summer heat had spoiled the lot in less than a week. Few professions tested patience quite like brewing, and yet the cycle continued because there was no alternative. People didn't brew because they wanted to impress their friends with artisanal craft ales. They brewed because, without it, the village would go thirsty. This constant negotiation with the seasons shaped not just individual households, but also institutions. Monasteries, with their resources and discipline, became especially important in stabilizing supply, producing ale at a scale and consistency that small brewers could rarely match. While households struggled with small batches and the whims of the weather, monasteries offered something different: scale, stability, and discipline. Brewing within monastic walls became one of the defining features of medieval times, not because monks were unusually thirsty, but because they had the organization and resources to do it well. Where a family might manage a few barrels at a time, a monastery could manage dozens. The results were more consistent, the supply more reliable, and the influence far-reaching. The daily schedule of monastic life almost encouraged brewing. Monks lived by a rigid timetable: prayers, work, meals and rest, repeated with little variation. Brewing slotted neatly into the category of labour, alongside gardening, copying manuscripts, and tending livestock. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many monastic orders, encouraged moderation in all things, but also allowed for a hemina of wine each day, roughly half a pint. In practice, monks extended this idea to ale, ensuring that they had enough on hand to supply not just themselves, but also guests, pilgrims, and the occasional noble benefactor. Monasteries had advantages households lacked. They could dedicate buildings to brewing, use larger vessels, and store their ale in cool cellars carved into stone. They had the manpower to haul grain, stoke fires, and manage fermentation at a scale few villagers could match. The result was ale that was not only more plentiful, but often better in quality. A monastery's reputation for good beer could enhance its standing in the region, much like a modern brewery with a devoted following, though monks were less interested in catchy slogans and more in reliable fermentation. Of course, moderation was still preached, at least officially. Sermons warned against drunkenness, and monks were expected to exemplify restraint. Whether they always did is another question. Records survive of abbots complaining about overindulgence among their brethren, which suggests that even men of prayer sometimes tested the limits of their daily allotment. One can imagine evening chants sung with just a little more enthusiasm after a generous serving of strong ale. Monastic brewing also contributed to the spread of knowledge. Monks kept written records, refining methods over time. While households relied on memory and instinct, monasteries preserved observations, passing them along through generations. This didn't make medieval beer scientific, but it did mean monasteries helped standardize practices. Later developments in brewing, particularly the use of hops, spread in part through monastic networks. In that sense, the monks were not just custodians of faith, but of fermentation. Humour finds its way in the contrast between image and reality. The stereotypical monk is imagined in quiet contemplation, quill in hand, copying sacred texts. Yet many also spent their days hauling barrels, stirring vats, and sniffing fermenting wort. It is hard to maintain an air of solemnity when your robe smells of boiling grain. Still, the work was necessary, and the ale produced sustained both the monastery and the surrounding community. Monastic brewing provided a dependable backbone for regions that might otherwise have gone without. But while monasteries could produce at scale, most drinking still happened outside their walls, in spaces that were far less orderly, far smokier, and far more unpredictable. These were the alehouses and taverns where villagers gathered, and where medieval drinking culture truly came alive. For all the discipline of monastic brewing, most people experienced ale not in cloisters, but in the rougher setting of the local alehouse. These establishments were the everyday venues of medieval drinking life. Small, crowded, smoky rooms where villagers gathered not so much for entertainment as for necessity. If your own household supply had run out, or if you preferred not to rely on the unpredictable quality of your neighbour's brewing, the alehouse offered a more convenient option. It was not glamorous, and certainly not comfortable, but it was reliable. Alehouses were usually run out of private homes. A family with enough space and brewing skill might open their doors to customers, offering mugs of ale in exchange for coins or barter. There were no neon signs, no menus, and very little in the way of service. A bench, a jug, and perhaps a fire in the hearth were the standard amenities. Light filtered through smoke rather than windows, and the air carried a permanent scent of spilled drink, damp clothing, and the faint hope that someone would eventually clean the rushes on the floor. These establishments played an important social role. People met there to exchange news, settle disputes, and escape the monotony of daily labour. Gossip spread quickly over shared mugs, while business deals were sealed with handshakes made stickier by ale residue. The atmosphere was not the raucous celebration of tavern scenes painted centuries later. It was closer to a village meeting hall with alcohol, where the same complaints about taxes, weather and livestock were repeated until the ale ran out. Alehouses were also closely watched by authorities. Officials understood that where people gathered, trouble followed. Laws were passed to regulate opening hours, quality of drink, and behaviour of patrons. Ale tasters, appointed by towns or manors, made the rounds to ensure that brewers met acceptable standards, though what counted as acceptable was often flexible, depending on the relationship between the taster and the alewife. It was one of the earliest forms of consumer protection, if by consumer protection one means preventing open revolt over a particularly watery pint. The humour of the alehouse lies in its ordinariness. Imagine a space barely larger than a modern kitchen, crammed with villagers balancing mugs, muttering over dice games, and elbowing for room at a splintered table. The closest thing to entertainment might be a traveller sharing a story, or a farmer insisting for the 5th time that his cow was the largest in the parish. There was no music unless someone hummed, no dancing unless someone stumbled, and no romantic candlelight unless the tallow lamp flickered by accident. Yet people kept coming, because ale was there, and being together was better than sitting in the dark at home. For all their flaws, alehouses gave communities a centre. They offered warmth, however smoky, company, however repetitive, and drink, however uneven. They were places where the rhythm of medieval life played out in public, one mug at a time. And where the alehouse was an extension of the household, the tavern represented something larger, a more ambitious space that catered to travellers, merchants, and those seeking more than just a smoky bench to sit on. If the alehouse was a villager's living room turned public, the tavern was a step up, not necessarily more comfortable, but certainly more ambitious. Taverns catered to a wider clientele, merchants on the road, clerks from nearby towns, and locals with a few more coins to spend. Unlike alehouses, which dealt primarily in ale, taverns often specialised in wine, especially in regions where imports from France or Spain arrived in steady quantities. This distinction gave taverns an air of sophistication, though the reality was rarely elegant. The tavern was louder, busier, and more prone to excess than the humble alehouse. Patrons gathered not just to drink, but to gamble, sing, and argue. Dice games were common, cards less so until later centuries. Betting on anything from animal fights to the weather was a favourite pastime, and tavern keepers were expected to tolerate the noise so long as coins kept clinking on the table. With so many people crammed together, taverns became breeding grounds for gossip. News travelled from one town to the next in the mouths of half-drunk merchants, retold with such embellishment that by the time it reached the next village, it bore little resemblance to the original story. For authorities, taverns were both useful and dangerous. They brought revenue through taxes and provided convenient locations to gather information. But they also attracted disorder, brawls, thefts, and the occasional stabbing when someone felt cheated at dice. Medieval officials tried to regulate them with varying degrees of success. Licenses were required, quality was supposedly monitored, and curfews were sometimes enforced. In practice, much depended on the tavern keeper's connections. A tavern that supplied local officials with free drink tended to encounter fewer inspections. The humour of tavern life often lies in the disconnect between reputation and reality. To later imaginations, a tavern conjures up hearty laughter, glowing hearths, and overflowing mugs. The truth was more modest: cramped rooms, sour wine, and arguments about livestock prices. Entertainment was rarely professional. A passing minstrel might strum a few notes, but most of the music came from patrons who insisted they could sing after 3 jugs of wine. The result was less harmonious chorus and more community shouting. Despite their flaws, taverns filled a vital role. They gave travellers a place to rest, merchants a place to bargain, and locals a chance to escape their routines. They were also one of the few spaces where different classes could mix, at least temporarily. A merchant might share a table with a farmer, or a clerk with a craftsman, their differences softened by drink. The illusion of equality rarely lasted past the final jug, but for a few hours it created a kind of social lubricant stronger than the wine itself. Taverns stood as markers of connectedness, points on the map where information, goods, and people converged. They were not comfortable, not refined, and not as entertaining as legend would have it, but they were indispensable to medieval society, and especially to anyone too far from home to rely on their own ale supply. For those on the move, taverns were often only part of the experience. Travellers also needed a place to sleep, eat, and recover before moving on. That role fell to the inn, which combined drink with lodging and promised, at least in theory, a bed less damp than the roadside. For the traveller, a tavern might provide drink, but it did not always provide a place to sleep. That was the purpose of the inn, where food, drink, and lodging came together under one roof. Inns were scattered along trade routes, in market towns, and near city gates, positioned where travellers were most likely to need them. They served merchants moving goods, pilgrims trudging toward shrines, and officials carrying letters or orders. To modernize, the inn might suggest hospitality and warmth. In medieval times, it suggested shelter from the rain, a roof overhead, and ale on the table. Anything beyond that was considered a luxury. The quality of inns varied enormously. A large establishment in a bustling town might offer private chambers, meals of meat and bread, and ale served in decent vessels. A smaller country inn might provide a common sleeping room, where strangers lay side by side on straw mattresses, sharing both warmth and fleas. Records describe beds holding 3 or 4 people at once, a practice that blurred the line between hospitality and endurance. Complaints were plentiful, but so were customers, because the alternatives were sleeping outdoors or pushing on to the next village. Food and drink were central to the experience. Ale was the constant, with stronger varieties sometimes available to wealthier guests. Wine might appear in regions with better access to imports, though rarely in the quality anyone would boast about later. Meals were simple but filling, often consisting of stews, bread, and cheese. Inns promised meat, but did not always specify what kind, leaving the guest to discover that detail on the plate. Humour aside, the emphasis was less on cuisine and more on volume, enough to fuel the next day's journey. Inns also served as hubs of information. Travellers exchanged news, merchants shared prices from distant markets, and locals picked up rumours of events beyond their village. In this sense, the inn functioned as both shelter and bulletin board, a place where the threads of medieval life crossed. Unfortunately, the reliability of this information was no better than the reliability of the beds. Stories grew in the telling, and a rumour carried from one inn to another might shift dramatically before it reached its final destination. Medieval Europe had no printing press yet, but it had plenty of talkative innkeepers. Despite their practical role, inns carried a reputation for vice. Clergy often denounced them as places of temptation, where drink, gambling, and loose behaviour mixed too freely. The criticisms may have been exaggerated, but they stuck. Inns were seen as necessary evils. No one wanted to do without them, but no one praised them too loudly either. The humour of the medieval inn is easy to imagine. A weary pilgrim finally reaches shelter after a day on the road, only to find a lumpy bed already occupied by two strangers, a meal that tastes suspiciously recycled, and ale that has clearly been stretched a little too far with water. Yet the same pilgrim returns to the inn on the way home, because the alternative is far worse. Complaints did not stop business. They simply became part of the experience. As important as inns were for travellers, they were not the only places where medieval drinking took on a social character. Within both alehouses and inns, guests sought amusement, and when there was no professional entertainment to be found, they created their own, in the form of songs, games, and rituals that filled long evenings with drink. Once travellers had settled at the inn, or villagers had found their way into the alehouse, the question quickly became how to pass the long hours that followed. There was no printed entertainment, no stage plays for common people, and no convenient deck of playing cards until much later. Instead, drinkers turned to their own inventions, simple songs, repetitive games, and rituals that transformed ordinary drinking into a kind of community performance. Songs were the most common. They were rarely sophisticated, often consisting of short verses repeated until everyone knew the words, or until no one could remember them correctly. The topics were predictable: praise of good ale, complaints about bad ale, boasts of strength, or jokes at the expense of neighbours. A travelling minstrel might occasionally supply more polished material, but most singing was done by the patrons themselves. The effect was less choir and more enthusiastic shouting. Still, the songs served their purpose. They kept spirits up, helped pass the time, and allowed participants to forget, at least temporarily, how smoky and cramped their surroundings really were. Games were equally uncomplicated. Dice were the most common, sometimes accompanied by crude boards scratched onto tables or floors. Wagers were placed in pennies, bread, or future favours. Cheating was rampant, accusations inevitable, and arguments common. The games themselves mattered less than the act of playing, which broke up the monotony of endless drinking. In the absence of dice, improvised competitions filled the gap. Who could drain a mug the fastest? Who could balance a jug on their head? Who could remain upright the longest after several rounds? The rules were simple, the stakes low, and the entertainment value sufficient to keep people engaged until fatigue set in. Rituals also formed a key part of drinking culture. Toasts were common, though less formal than in later centuries. One person would raise a mug, shout something barely coherent, and everyone else would drink in agreement. Pledges of loyalty, oaths of friendship, or the occasional clumsy declaration of love were all delivered over shared cups. These rituals bound groups together, even if the bonds sometimes dissolved by morning. The sense of belonging mattered as much as the drink itself. The humour here lies in the image of patrons turning the simplest activities into endless diversion. A single dice game could stretch for hours, fueled more by stubbornness than by excitement. A song with only 3 lines might be sung until no one remembered how it started. A toast that began sincerely could end in laughter when someone spilled half their mug down their tunic. This was not polished entertainment, but it was enough. What these songs and games reveal is how central drink was to medieval sociability. It was not just about quenching thirst, but about creating a rhythm to evenings that might otherwise have been silent and dull. The alehouse and inn became theatres of the ordinary, where the performance consisted of nothing more than people drinking together, loudly insisting that they were enjoying themselves. And yet, there were occasions when this everyday rhythm expanded into something far larger. On feast days, festivals, and celebrations, drinking left the smoky confines of the alehouse and spilled into the streets, taking on a scale and intensity that everyday mugs could not match. If songs and games filled the evenings of ordinary life, feasts and festivals marked the moments when drinking moved from routine to spectacle. These occasions were rare enough to feel special, but frequent enough that most people experienced them at least a few times a year. Religious holidays, harvest celebrations, weddings and civic events all provided excuses for the ale to flow more freely than usual. What made these gatherings stand out was not just the quantity of drink, but the shift in atmosphere. For once, the focus was not on moderation, but on indulgence. At a feast hosted by a noble household, strong ale and wine were the centerpiece of hospitality. To underserve guests was to risk insult. To overserve them was a safer gamble. The tables might groan with food, but it was the drink that kept conversation lively and reputations buoyant. Records describe barrels emptied with enthusiasm, goblets refilled without pause, and toasts offered in such rapid succession that no one could follow the thread of the speeches. The goal was not to stagger home discreetly, but to demonstrate abundance. Drunkenness at such occasions was less a failing than a kind of social proof, a visible sign that the host had provided enough. Festivals at the village level were different in scale but similar in spirit. Ale brewed for the event was often stronger than the daily fare, set aside in advance for the occasion. Temporary stalls or open barrels might line the village green, and neighbours who ordinarily measured their rations carefully allowed themselves to drink more than usual. Music, dancing and competitions accompanied the drinking, though it is fair to assume that most of these activities declined in quality as the evening wore on. What mattered was not performance, but participation. The church, never comfortable with excess, alternated between permitting and condemning these displays. On the one hand, feast days were part of the liturgical calendar and celebration was encouraged. On the other, drunkenness was consistently denounced from the pulpit. The result was a kind of uneasy compromise. Priests tolerated what could not be stopped, occasionally reminding parishioners the next morning that moderation would have been preferable. The cycle repeated year after year, suggesting that the sermons were not entirely persuasive. For humour, one need only imagine the chaos of such gatherings. A noble attempting to deliver a solemn toast, while servants refilled his goblet against his will. A village dance that began as orderly steps and ended as a tangle of arms, legs, and laughter. Children darting through crowds of adults who were in no position to supervise them. Even livestock sometimes made appearances, either as prizes in drinking contests or as unintended participants when someone forgot to secure the gate. What set feasts and festivals apart was not that people drank more, but that they did so with permission. The line between everyday moderation and holiday excess was clear, and crossing it was temporarily acceptable. When the barrels were drained and the songs faded, life returned to its quieter rhythm of small beer and work. But for a brief span, drinking became not just sustenance, but spectacle. As memorable as these occasions were, they represented only a fraction of medieval drinking culture. The everyday reality still revolved around ale, but it was not the only drink available. Wine, cider, mead, and even exotic imports all had their place, though in much smaller quantities and usually reserved for those who could afford them. If ale was the drink of everyday life, wine belonged to those who could afford more than survival. In medieval times, wine was associated with wealth, power, and proximity to trade routes. Regions like France, Spain, and the Rhineland produced it in abundance, but in much of northern Europe it was an import, which meant it was expensive. Nobles, clergy, and prosperous merchants were the most likely to drink it, and even they treated it as a mark of status rather than a casual beverage. Wine appeared most prominently at the tables of lords and bishops. Serving wine signalled access to resources and connections, especially if the wine had travelled far to arrive at the feast. To pour it freely was to demonstrate generosity. To pour it sparingly was to remind guests how valuable it was. Monasteries with vineyards often reserved wine for their abbots or for special liturgical use, leaving the brothers to drink ale. In this way, wine reinforced hierarchy. It was less about hydration and more about reputation. The quality varied considerably. In southern regions where vineyards were common, wine could be consumed regularly and in fresher condition. In northern lands, however, the long journey from vineyard to table meant the drink often lost something along the way. What arrived in barrels was not always the rich, fragrant beverage sung about by poets. More often it was sour, thin, or unremarkable. Still, the mere fact of drinking wine carried enough weight that guests pretended not to notice, or at least refrained from saying so loudly. Wine also played a role in diplomacy. Gifts of wine travelled between courts, and treaties were toasted with goblets filled to emphasize the bond. The symbolism mattered more than the taste. A sour mouthful was swallowed anyway, for the sake of appearances. Clergy, too, used wine in religious rites. Its presence sanctified even when its flavour left something to be desired. The Eucharist was not an occasion for commentary on tannins. Humour lies in the gap between expectation and reality. Picture a northern noble boasting of his imported casks, only for his guests to wince discreetly after the first sip. Or a merchant paying a high price for what was promised as a fine vintage, only to discover it tasted suspiciously like vinegar left too long in the sun. Complaints were muted because no one wanted to appear ungrateful or unsophisticated. The result was a culture where drinking wine was impressive even when the wine itself was not. For those who could afford it, wine offered variety. For those who could not, it remained out of reach, admired from afar in stories and songs. Ale might have sustained the masses, but wine sustained social distinctions. It was the drink of wealth, even when the taste betrayed the journey it had taken. Of course, status alone could not protect against spoilage. The difficulties of transporting and storing wine meant that even the rich sometimes ended up with barrels that were closer to vinegar than to vintage. And when that happened, wealth provided little consolation. The taste was still terrible. Wine may have been the drink of wealth, but wealth did not guarantee quality. Transporting and storing wine in medieval times was a risky business. Barrels travelled by cart, ship, or river barge, often for weeks or months before reaching their destination. Heat, rough handling, or simply poor sealing could turn a promising cask into something that tasted closer to vinegar than vintage. Nobles might boast of their imported wine, but servants tasked with opening the barrel often discovered the contents had soured. The polite solution was to serve it anyway, with enough spices or honey to mask the flaws. Spoilage was the most common problem. Without modern corks, bottles, or temperature control, wine was vulnerable from the moment it left the vineyard. A shipment from Bordeaux might leave France full of promise, only to arrive in England tasting faintly of seawater and oak. Even locally produced wine was not immune, since medieval storage relied on wooden barrels that leaked, warped, or absorbed flavours from previous contents. In some cases, the only thing worse than no wine was wine that had been stored too long. Adulteration added to the problem. Cellars, eager to stretch their supply, sometimes watered down their wine or mixed in questionable additives. Regulations existed, but enforcement was uneven. Complaints survive in town records about dishonest tavern keepers and merchants who sold wine that was thinner than expected. Customers grumbled, but they drank it anyway, because rejecting wine outright risked appearing unrefined. Better to swallow disappointment along with the drink than to admit you had been fooled. The humour lies in imagining the reactions of guests. A lord raises his goblet, praises the fine vintage, and then discreetly winces as the sourness hits. A merchant brags of his imported stock, only to discover his friends are swallowing with expressions that suggest loyalty more than enjoyment. Few dared to complain openly, for fear of insulting the host or admitting they could not appreciate what was being offered. The result was an elaborate game of social pretending, where bad wine was still better than no wine at all. Medical writers of the period even acknowledged the issue, recommending that poor quality wine be boiled, sweetened, or infused with herbs to make it more palatable. These fixes sometimes worked, sometimes failed, and sometimes created flavours no one wanted to remember. Yet the persistence of such advice shows just how common the problem was. Wine might have been a marker of status, but its reliability left much to be desired. For the wealthy, bad wine was an embarrassment. For the rest of society, it was irrelevant. They were unlikely to taste wine in the first place. Instead, they turned to other drinks that were cheaper, more accessible, and often more reliable. Chief among these were ciders and perries, the fermented gifts of apple and pear orchards that dotted the countryside. Cider and perry belonged to the countryside, where orchards provided a steady alternative to grain and imported grapes. Villagers with access to apples or pears discovered that pressing and fermenting the juice produced drinks that were inexpensive, local, and dependable. Unlike wine, which had to travel long distances, or ale, which required laborious brewing, cider and perry could be made with relatively little equipment. Press the fruit, leave the juice to ferment, and in a matter of days a household had a drinkable supply. The simplicity of the process gave these beverages a distinctly regional character. Each orchard produced its own flavor, influenced by soil, fruit variety, and the patience of the household fermenter. A jug of cider in one valley might taste sweet and sharp, while another, only a few miles away, leaned sour and earthy. Such differences were rarely celebrated in writing, but villagers knew them well. They argued cheerfully over whose orchard yielded the best drink, though these arguments were settled less by evidence than by who had the fullest barrel at the time. Because cider and perry spoiled quickly, they were consumed close to where they were made. Long-distance trade was rare, and chronicles of royal courts or noble feasts mention them only in passing, if at all. This local confinement meant that cider and perry never carried the prestige of wine. They were tied to rural life, known and appreciated by the people who pressed them, but invisible in the grander narratives of medieval Europe. Their anonymity, however, was part of their strength. While nobles fretted about the condition of imported casks, villagers poured mugs of cider without much worry. For daily life, these drinks offered small but welcome variety. Ale might dominate, but cider and perry provided different flavors, the sweetness of apples, the tang of pears, that broke up the monotony of grain-based beverages. Their strength was moderate, often enough to bring warmth to an evening, but not enough to disrupt the next day's labor. Children drank weaker versions alongside their parents, and in years of abundant harvests, cider could be found on many tables throughout the village. In leaner years, when orchards yielded little, the loss was felt keenly, though not with the desperation reserved for failed grain crops. The humour lies in their unpretentiousness. A noble could boast of his imported Bordeaux. A monk might praise the consistency of his monastery's brew, but a villager with cider simply poured and drank. No elaborate rituals, no poetic odes, no clerical debates. It was fermented fruit juice, plain and simple. It might sour quickly, and it might leave a layer of pulp in the bottom of the jug, but no one pretended it was more than it was. In that way, cider and perry were perhaps the most honest drinks of the medieval world. From apples and pears it was only a short step to honey. If grains could be brewed and fruit could be pressed, then surely honey could be fermented as well. The result was mead, a drink that carried a reputation far grander in song and legend than it ever managed to achieve in daily medieval life. Mead occupied a peculiar place in medieval times. Made by fermenting honey with water, sometimes flavoured with herbs or spices, it carried a reputation larger than its actual presence. Ballads and legends often described mead as the drink of heroes and warriors, a golden beverage passed around in great halls. The reality was more restrained. Mead was brewed and consumed, yes, but far less frequently than ale, cider, or wine. Honey was expensive, labour-intensive to harvest, and limited in supply. Turning it into alcohol was something a community might do occasionally, not routinely. Where mead did appear, it tended to mark special occasions, weddings, feast days, or gatherings of particular importance might feature a batch. Its sweetness set it apart from the sharper flavours of ale or cider, making it memorable even if it wasn't plentiful. People remarked on mead not because it was everywhere, but because it was rare. A mug of it suggested celebration, the same way champagne does today. Only in this case the bubbles were replaced by sediment and the cork by a wooden stopper. The process of making mead was simpler than brewing ale, but slower in its rewards. Honey diluted with water fermented readily, though it could take weeks or months before the drink was palatable. Patience was essential. which meant most households avoided it unless they had honey to spare and the ability to wait. Ale might be ready in days. Mead required foresight. This too limited its place in everyday life. A family that brewed mead for a wedding was unlikely to repeat the effort until the next major milestone. Mead also carried associations with status. Nobles and wealthy patrons had better access to honey, which meant they were more likely to serve it. Monasteries with beehives occasionally produced mead as well, though even they treated it as an occasional luxury. It was not the drink that kept monks chanting through long winters or peasants ploughing fields through long summers. It was the drink that appeared when someone wanted to impress, reward, or mark a special moment. Humour slips in when comparing reputation to reality. A bard might sing of mead as the glorious drink of warriors, but in truth most warriors were far more familiar with the taste of weak ale. A newly married couple might toast with mead at their wedding, only to spend the rest of their lives drinking small beer at breakfast. Even the word honeymoon is sometimes traced to the tradition of newlyweds drinking mead for a month after marriage, though one suspects the moon phase ended less with romance and more with indigestion. In the larger picture of medieval drinking, mead was a glittering accent, not the foundation. Its presence in songs and stories outweighed its actual consumption, which makes it memorable to us today, but peripheral to those who lived then. Still, its legend mattered. To speak of mead was to invoke celebration, sweetness, and rarity. And that reputation carried enough weight that when traders and nobles encountered exotic spiced wines or imported specialties, they often compared them to mead, as though seeking to measure new flavors against the golden standard of old tales. Beyond ale, cider, and the occasional mead, there existed drinks that travelled great distances to reach medieval tables. These were the exotic imports, beverages infused with spices, sweetened with sugar, or otherwise altered to appeal to wealthier palates. The most famous among them was Hippocras, a spiced wine usually mixed with cinnamon, ginger, and sometimes cloves or grains of paradise. Imported spices made the drink costly, which meant it appeared almost exclusively in noble households or at lavish feasts. Its role was less about quenching thirst and more about displaying access to luxury goods. The appeal of such imports was partly novelty. Ale was dependable but dull, cider was refreshing but local, and even mead was rare without being exotic. A spiced wine, glowing with unfamiliar flavours, offered a sense of connection to distant lands. For nobles, serving Hippocras was a way of demonstrating both wealth and worldliness. To drink it was to participate in a network of trade that stretched far beyond the village or even the kingdom. The taste itself may not have pleased every guest, but the symbolism mattered more than the flavour. These drinks also carried medicinal claims. Spices were thought to balance the humours, aid digestion, or ward off illness. Physicians recommended them in small doses, which nobles conveniently interpreted as permission to drink more than necessary. The association between exotic imports and health added to their prestige. After all, a cup of Hippocras might be justified not only as indulgence, but as responsible self-care. Whether it cured anything beyond monotony is doubtful, but the belief persisted. Humour emerges when considering how these drinks were received. A noble might grimace at the overpowering taste of cinnamon, but continue drinking to avoid appearing unsophisticated. A guest might pretend to savour a goblet of syrupy spiced wine while secretly longing for a simple mug of ale. The irony is that while these beverages were marketed as refined, Many were so heavily doctored that their base wines were almost unrecognizable. Exotic, yes. Enjoyable, not always. For the common villager, these imports remained distant curiosities. They might hear of them in stories, see them mentioned in records, or taste them once in a lifetime at a festival hosted by a generous lord. But they were not part of ordinary drinking culture. To most people, Hippocras and other specialties were about as relevant as silk robes or jeweled goblets, intriguing to imagine, irrelevant in practice. Still, their presence in medieval drinking culture mattered, if only as contrast. They highlighted the divide between ordinary and elite consumption, reminding everyone that status could be measured in what filled one's cup. And while exotic imports sparkled briefly in noble feasts, the containers that held them, whether wooden mugs, pewter goblets, or shared bowls, were as much a part of the story as the drinks themselves. The story of medieval drinking is not only about what was poured, but also about what it was poured into. Drinking vessels shaped the experience just as much as the ale or wine inside them. In a world without standardized glassware or mass production, the choice of cup revealed much about status, wealth, and practicality. The humble peasant, the travelling merchant, and the noble lord all lifted different vessels to their lips, each appropriate to their station. Wooden cups and bowls were the most common. They were inexpensive, easy to carve, and durable enough to survive daily use. A household might keep a few such vessels in constant circulation, worn smooth by years of handling. Horn cups, made from cattle horns polished and hollowed, were also popular. They looked striking but were less practical, since they could not stand on their own without special fittings. A horn of ale had to be drained before it could be set down, which may explain why they featured so prominently in feasting traditions. Nothing speeds up drinking like an inability to put the cup down. For those with more resources, pottery and pewter vessels offered sturdier options. Ceramic mugs could be decorated, glazed, and shaped in ways that wooden cups could not. Pewter tankards, though prone to denting, gave drinkers the satisfaction of heft and permanence. These materials made their way into taverns and inns, where customers expected something more reliable than a communal bowl. Shared drinking was still common, but as vessels improved, the opportunity to have one's own mug became more widespread. At the highest levels of society, vessels became statements of wealth. Nobles drank from silver goblets, glass imported from Venice, or intricately carved chalices. These items were less about function and more about display. A silver cup announced prestige, even if the wine inside had travelled too far and turned sour. Guests were expected to notice the vessel, praise its craftsmanship, and politely ignore the quality of its contents. In some cases, the cup mattered more than the drink. Humour lingers in the variety. Imagine the nobleman sipping delicately from an ornate chalice, while his tenant farmer gulps from a bowl carved with more enthusiasm than skill. Or picture the awkwardness of a guest presented with a horn that must be drained in one go, regardless of how much they actually wanted to drink. Medieval vessels remind us that drinking was a social act as much as a practical one, and the container itself often shaped the ritual. Over time, storage and serving vessels became just as important as what was on the table. Barrels, jugs, and cellars determined whether ale stayed fresh, wine soured, or cider turned undrinkable. To understand how medieval drinks reached those mugs and goblets, we turn to the containers that kept them from spoiling, or at least tried to. The vessel in a drinker's hand told part of the story, but the real challenge was keeping ale and wine drinkable long enough to reach those vessels in the first place. Medieval storage relied heavily on barrels, and the success or failure of a batch often depended less on the brewing process than on what happened once it was sealed inside. A well-made barrel kept ale fresh for days or weeks. A poorly made one ruined the contents in less time than it took to complain about it. Barrels were practical for transport and storage. Made of oak or other hardwoods, bound with iron hoops, and shaped to be rolled rather than carried, they were the backbone of medieval drink distribution. Alewives stored their brews in small casks, monasteries in larger tun barrels, and merchants in anything they could fit onto carts or boats. The technology was clever for the age. Curved staves formed a tight seal without glue or nails, flexing slightly as the liquid pressed outward. But the system was far from foolproof. Spoilage was a constant threat. Warm weather, cracks in the wood, or careless handling could turn ale sour or wine vinegary in short order. Brewers and sellers tried to mask these flaws with herbs, spices, or honey, but customers often noticed. Complaints survive in local records of ale that was too thin or wine that was turned. Fines could be levied against sellers whose barrels failed the test, though enforcement was uneven. One suspects that a friendly relationship with the local ale taster did wonders for a brewer's reputation. Even when barrels did their job, the shelf life of most drinks was limited. Ale was expected to be consumed quickly before it spoiled. Wine travelled farther, but distance was always a risk. Cider and perry were the most fragile, spoiling within days unless conditions were unusually cool. The result was a culture of constant replenishment. Brewing, pressing, and importing never really stopped because no one could rely on storage alone. Humour emerges when imagining the medieval drinker's resignation. A peasant opens a cask, discovers it has soured, sighs, and drinks it anyway. A tavern keeper rolls a barrel into place, only to find half the contents have leaked into the street. Nobles fared no better. A silver goblet did little to disguise the fact that its contents tasted like sharp vinegar. Spoilage was democratic. It struck rich and poor alike. Because storage was unreliable, measuring out what survived became even more important. The challenge was not only keeping ale and wine from spoiling, but also deciding how much of it should be served to each person at a time. And in medieval times, even something as simple as a pint was less straightforward than it sounds. Once the ale had been brewed, stored, and hopefully spared from spoilage, the next question was how much to serve. Medieval drinking culture was shaped not only by what people drank, but by how it was measured. Unlike today, where a pint is a pint across much of the world, medieval measures varied wildly from one town or kingdom to the next. A pint in one region could be twice the size of a pint elsewhere, and the same went for quarts, gallons, and other units. The result was a system in which everyone agreed that measures mattered, but no one agreed on what those measures actually were. Ale was often sold by the gallon, half-gallon, or quart, though the exact size of those units was anything but fixed. Town records reveal disputes between customers and alewives over short measures, with local officials occasionally stepping in to standardise jugs and tankards. Inspectors known as ale conners or ale tasters sometimes checked not just the quality of the drink, but the fairness of the measures. Their methods ranged from practical, comparing jugs against official standards, to eccentric, such as spilling ale onto a bench and sitting in it to judge its stickiness. Whatever the technique, the goal was to prevent sellers from cheating customers by watering down drinks or serving less than promised. In practice, however, inconsistencies remained. A traveller moving between towns quickly learned that a pint was whatever the local innkeeper said it was. Some places served generous mugs that would put modern servings to shame. Others leaned toward thimble rigs, where a so-called pint barely wet the lips. Humour enters in the mental image of a weary traveller celebrating a large pour in one village, only to be bitterly disappointed at the next. Complaints followed, but as long as people kept drinking, little changed. Large feasts and festivals often used communal measures, with drinks served in shared bowls, pitchers or horns rather than individual mugs. These containers rarely conformed to any standard size. A guest could drain a horn and boast of finishing a pint, though the horn might have held closer to a quart. Such imprecision suited the atmosphere. Feasts were less about accuracy and more about demonstrating abundance. If the vessel was large and the drink plentiful, no one quibbled over units. For the everyday villager, serving sizes were a balance between economy and necessity. Too much at once risked waste if the ale went flat or sour before it was finished. Too little left drinkers unsatisfied and suspicious that they were being shorted. The negotiation between customer and seller was constant, reinforcing the social role of measures in medieval drinking culture. In the end, measures mattered less for exactness and more for ritual. A full jug, whatever its size, represented hospitality. A short measure, whatever the excuse, risked resentment. The medieval system of serving sizes may seem chaotic now, but it reflected a world where precision was less important than perception. Still, not all complaints about ale were about volume. Sometimes the issue was taste, and medieval brewers had plenty of tricks, both honest and questionable, for masking flaws with herbs, spices, and other additions. Complaints about short measures were one thing, but flavour was another. Medieval drinkers often faced mugs of ale that were too sour, too thin, or simply unpleasant. Brewers responded with additives and flavourings, some intended to improve taste, others to disguise flaws. Herbs, spices, and even unexpected ingredients made their way into barrels, turning each brew into something of an experiment. Modern craft brewers may boast of innovation, but their medieval predecessors were improvising centuries earlier with far less consistency. The most common mixture was gruit, a blend of herbs used to flavour ale before hops became widespread. Recipes for gruit varied by region and by brewer, but common ingredients included bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, and juniper. These herbs added bitterness, aroma, and in some cases mild preservative qualities. They also gave each ale a distinct local character, since no two mixtures were exactly alike. Drinkers accustomed to one region's gruit might find another's almost unrecognisable, though politeness usually prevented them from saying so out loud. Beyond gruit, brewers experimented with whatever was available. Sage, thyme, and even heather appeared in some records. Spices like cinnamon or cloves could be added, though their expense meant they were rare. More questionable were the additives used to mask spoilage. Chalk to lighten colour, soot to darken it, or even henbane and other psychoactive herbs to give the illusion of strength. These last practices drew the attention of authorities, who occasionally cracked down on brewers suspected of making their ale a little too interesting. Humour creeps in when imagining the results. One village's ale might taste pleasantly herbal, while another's carried notes best described as medicinal accident. A customer expecting refreshment might instead feel an unexpected buzz, courtesy of herbs chosen less for flavor than for effect. Medieval drinkers tolerated this variability with stoic endurance, much as modern diners tolerate the occasional disappointing restaurant meal. Complaining loudly risked offending the alewife. Better to drink, grimace quietly, and hope the next barrel was better. Additives also served symbolic purposes. A noble might order spices added to ale for a feast, more to demonstrate wealth than to improve taste. Guests were expected to admire the cinnamon or ginger, even if the ale beneath remained unremarkable. The drink became less about flavor and more about performance, a liquid way of announcing status. What stands out is the sheer flexibility of medieval brewing. Without rigid recipes or standardized ingredients, every batch was unique. Some were tolerable, some memorable, and some best forgotten, but all reflected the ingenuity of brewers working with what they had, in a world where drink had to be consumed regardless of quality. These improvisations highlight why the eventual introduction of hops was so significant. Before hops, flavor relied on gruit and other herbs. After hops, brewing began to stabilize around a single bittering plant. The transition was gradual, contested, and deeply influential, shaping not only taste, but the economics of brewing for centuries to come. For centuries, gruit gave ale its character. The mixture of herbs varied so much that no two villages produced the same taste. But in time, another plant began to reshape the brewing world: hops. Today it seems impossible to imagine beer without hops, but in medieval times their use was controversial. The debate was not only about flavor, but also about economics, regulation, and tradition. What we think of as a simple ingredient change was, in fact, a small social revolution poured into a cup. Gruit had long been controlled by local authorities. Towns or bishops claimed rights over its sale, charging fees for access to the herb mixtures. This gave them a steady stream of revenue, and brewers little choice but to comply. Hops threatened that system. Unlike gruit, hops could be cultivated in fields, purchased freely, and used without permission from a local official. The shift from gruit to hops wasn't just a change in taste, it was a challenge to established power. Taste itself divided opinion. Hopped beer had a sharper bitterness and kept longer, thanks to the plant's natural preservative qualities. For merchants and travellers, this was invaluable. A barrel of hopped beer could survive journeys that would have ruined ordinary ale. For traditional drinkers, however, the bitterness seemed strange, even unpleasant. Many preferred the herbal notes of gruit, which varied widely but felt familiar. The dispute grew sharp enough that some towns banned hopped beer outright, claiming it was unhealthy, foreign, or downright unchristian. The irony, of course, is that hops eventually won. Their preservative qualities made them too useful to ignore, and as brewing grew into a larger commercial enterprise, consistency mattered more than tradition. By the late Middle Ages, hopped beer was spreading across Europe, carried by merchants from regions like the Low Countries, where hop cultivation was strong. The gruit system, once profitable for authorities, declined steadily. By the time modern brewing took shape, hops had become the defining feature of beer, while gruit lingered only in memory and occasional revival. Humour arises in the idea of medieval villagers debating flavour notes centuries before craft beer culture existed. One imagines a customer at the alehouse muttering that the new hopped drink was too bitter. while another insisted it was refreshing, and a third declared that all ale tasted the same after the third jug anyway. The arguments, though more practical than poetic, echoed the same tensions between innovation and tradition that define drinking culture today. The transition from gruit to hops marked more than a change in ingredients. It signaled the increasing commercialization of brewing, the decline of local monopolies, and the gradual standardization of taste. Ale was no longer entirely local or unpredictable. It was becoming a product that could be stored, transported, and expected to taste more or less the same from one barrel to the next. With these shifts in flavor and production came new questions about alcohol's place in society. Doctors and clerics alike weighed in, debating whether drinking was a medicine, a necessity, or a vice. And their answers shaped not just what people drank, but how they understood its effects on the body and the soul. As brewing practices shifted and new ingredients like hops began to reshape taste and storage, another group stepped in to comment on drink. The physicians. Medieval medicine, rooted in humoral theory, viewed everything a person consumed as an influence on the delicate balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Ale, wine, cider, and mead were no exception. To the medieval doctor, alcohol was not just a beverage. It was a substance that could heal or harm, depending on who drank it, when, and in what quantity. Wine especially was praised for its supposed medicinal qualities. Medical writers described it as warming, cleansing, and useful in aiding digestion. It was prescribed to the sick in carefully measured amounts, often diluted with water or infused with herbs. Some physicians recommended spiced wine for stomach troubles, others for melancholy, and nearly all of them found reasons why a little wine might be helpful in moderation. Nobles and clergy, who already preferred wine, no doubt appreciated this medical endorsement. Ale was treated with more caution. Physicians acknowledged its nourishing qualities. After all, it was liquid grain, but worried about its heaviness. Some claimed it caused sluggishness. Others linked it to digestive problems if consumed in excess. Yet even the skeptics had to admit that small beer kept people hydrated without the risks of water. In practice, medical advice about ale tended to sound like common sense. Drink it if you must, but avoid overindulgence. A recommendation easier to write in a treatise than to enforce in a tavern. Mead and cider received less attention in medical texts, but were not ignored. Mead's sweetness made it a candidate for treating certain ailments, though doctors warned that it could overheat the body if consumed too freely. Cider was considered cooling, perhaps too much so for those already prone to phlegmatic conditions. These judgments may sound arbitrary today, but they reflected the logic of humoral balance that guided all medieval medical thought. Humor surfaces when imagining the gap between theory and practice. A physician might solemnly prescribe half a cup of diluted wine after meals, while the patient cheerfully ignored him and drank 3 full goblets at the nearest tavern. Another might warn against the sluggishness caused by ale, only to deliver this lecture to a room full of monks already nodding off after their daily ration. The tension between medical caution and everyday necessity was constant, and unsurprisingly, necessity usually won. What these medical writings show is that alcohol was not dismissed as frivolous. It was integrated into broader ideas of health, diet, and balance. Doctors recognized that people would keep drinking regardless of advice, so their role was to guide rather than forbid. Still, even as physicians tried to regulate drinking through theory, another authority loomed larger in people's lives. The clergy had their own opinions about alcohol, opinions delivered not in quiet treatises, but in sermons, confessions, and moral warnings that echoed from pulpit to tavern. Physicians may have advised moderation, but the clergy made a career of demanding it. Sermons across medieval times returned again and again to the dangers of drink. Alehouses, taverns, and even noble feasts were easy targets for preachers searching for examples of human weakness. Wine might have been blessed in the chalice at Mass, but the same drink in excess was condemned from the pulpit. The line between sacred use and sinful indulgence was fine enough that parishioners probably felt whiplash, moving from Sunday service to Sunday supper. Clerical complaints fell into familiar themes. Drunkenness was linked to sloth, lust, and violence, the classic catalogue of sins. Parish priests warned that too much ale clouded judgment, too much wine inflamed passion, and too much mead encouraged idleness. Some preachers went further, arguing that excessive drinking endangered the soul itself. A man stumbling out of a tavern might not just be unsteady on his feet, they claimed, but unsteady on the path to salvation. The message was clear. Moderation was a virtue, overindulgence a vice. At the same time, the church was deeply entangled in alcohol. Monasteries brewed, bishops collected taxes on wine, and parish feasts often included drink in abundance. The hypocrisy was not lost on ordinary people, who likely smiled politely at a sermon on sobriety before returning home to refill their mugs. Humour lives in that contradiction. The same cleric who blessed the vineyard's harvest might deliver a fiery homily against drunkenness, only to retire afterward with a well-filled goblet. The church's concern was not entirely misplaced. Alcohol did play a role in disorderly behaviour, from brawls in taverns to neglect of duties in the fields. Parish records contain scoldings for workers who showed up late or not at all after a night of heavy drinking. Still, the vehemence of clerical warnings suggests that the problem was less epidemic and more symbolic. Condemning drink was a way to address broader anxieties about self-control, morality, and social order. Some clergy tried for practical compromise. Rather than demanding total abstinence, which would have been both unpopular and unrealistic, they urged moderation. Advice manuals recommended limiting drink to certain times of day or consuming it only with meals. This middle ground allowed the church to maintain its moral authority while tacitly accepting that no community was going to abandon ale altogether. The tone of these sermons often bordered on theatrical. Accounts survive of preachers pacing dramatically, raising their voices, and painting lurid pictures of the drunkard's fate. One can imagine a weary congregation nodding along, not because they were moved, but because they knew the sooner the sermon ended, the sooner they could get to dinner. In that sense, the clergy's message may have been less persuasive than they hoped, yet the church's warnings fed into a wider pattern. Attempts by both religious and secular authorities to regulate drinking. While preachers thundered from the pulpit, local laws quietly codified fines, punishments, and restrictions on drunkenness. Together, these efforts formed a framework of control that reveals just how central alcohol was to medieval life and how difficult it was to contain. While the church thundered from pulpits about the dangers of drink, secular authorities took a more practical approach. They fined people for it. Drunkenness in medieval times was not merely a moral failing but also a legal inconvenience. A drunk villager was more likely to disturb the peace, damage property, or forget to pay taxes, and none of these outcomes pleased local officials. To manage the problem, laws were drawn up, punishments were assigned, and the business of regulating alcohol entered the legal record. Many towns appointed officials specifically to monitor taverns and alehouses. These inspectors were tasked with making sure drinks were sold at fair strength and fair measure, but they also kept an eye out for disorder. If a patron grew too loud, aggressive, or unsteady, the authorities could impose fines or haul the offender into court. Repeat offenders sometimes found themselves in the stocks, where neighbours could throw rotten vegetables and remind them that public drunkenness had consequences. It was humiliation as law enforcement, and it worked well enough that records mention it frequently. Punishments varied by region. In some places, fines were the standard response, a few pennies for the first offence, more for the second, and so on. Elsewhere, corporal punishment was used, with drunkards briefly confined, whipped, or displayed in public. None of these measures eliminated excessive drinking, but they reinforced the message that private indulgence was one thing, public disorder another. Authorities were less interested in preventing people from drinking than in preventing people from disturbing others while doing it. The humour of these laws lies in their selective enforcement. A poor farmer caught singing too loudly outside a tavern might spend the night in the stocks, while a wealthy merchant staggering home from a feast could expect leniency. In theory, justice was blind. In practice, it seemed to squint favourably at anyone with the means to pay a bribe or a larger tax bill. Villagers knew this and complained accordingly, though usually not loudly enough to attract official attention. Despite these inconsistencies, the existence of laws against drunkenness shows how widespread drinking was. Authorities did not bother legislating against behaviours that were rare. Drunkenness was common enough that it needed managing, though not so overwhelming that it threatened to collapse society. The balance between tolerance and punishment reflected the reality. Alcohol was essential, but so was order. Court records, sermons, and town ordinances together paint a picture of a society negotiating its relationship with drink. People drank daily, often in large quantities, but most of the time without major trouble. When trouble arose, the law stepped in, not to end drinking altogether, but to keep it within acceptable bounds. This historical framework helps explain why later generations exaggerated the idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was drunk. The reality was more complicated, shaped by routine, necessity, and occasional excess. To separate myth from fact, it is worth examining how much medieval people truly drank, and how sober they actually were. The persistence of laws against disorderly drinking has fed a modern belief that everyone in medieval times lived in a permanent state of intoxication. It is an image easy to conjure: peasants swaying through fields, monks slurring their chants, nobles collapsing after feasts. Entertaining, yes. Accurate, not quite. The truth is more mundane. People drank constantly, but they were not constantly drunk. The key is strength. Most ale consumed daily was weak, often closer to 1 or 2% alcohol. A gallon of small beer might sound staggering by modern standards, but spread over an entire day and combined with hard physical labour, its effects were mild. Stronger ales existed, and wine could carry more potency, but these were not consumed in the same unending quantities. Drinking was a constant part of life, but intoxication was usually the exception, not the rule. Travelers' accounts add nuance. Visitors from regions where wine was common sometimes remarked on the sheer volume of ale consumed in Northern Europe, but they did not describe whole populations stumbling about. Instead, they noted that ale was served with every meal, to every age, as casually as bread. Chroniclers mentioned disorderly drinking precisely because it was unusual enough to merit comment. If everyone were drunk all the time, tavern brawls would not have stood out in the record. This is not to say drunkenness never happened. Feasts, festivals, and special occasions saw plenty of excess, as clergy and local laws made clear. But everyday life required functioning adults. Fields had to be ploughed, livestock tended, walls repaired, and prayers recited. A perpetually drunk population would not have survived the rigours of medieval existence. The myth of universal drunkenness survives partly because it makes the past more colourful, and partly because later commentators, including Protestant reformers, found it useful to paint earlier centuries as decadent and unruly. The humour lies in the contrast between perception and reality. Picture a modern historian explaining that, no, medieval people were not permanently drunk, only mildly buzzed for most of their waking hours, or a peasant insisting he is perfectly sober after his fifth mug of small beer, which, technically, he is. The line between hydration and intoxication was thinner than today, but people managed it with surprising efficiency. What emerges is a picture of balance. Alcohol was everywhere, consumed by all ages and classes, but society adapted around it. Weak ale was treated as food, stronger drink as special, and drunkenness as noteworthy rather than normal. The myth of constant inebriation oversimplifies a culture that was both practical and flexible in its relationship to drink. As the Middle Ages drew toward their close, however, new technologies began to change that balance. Distillation introduced stronger spirits into European life, altering both the possibilities and the problems of drinking. What had once been a steady flow of weak ale now had to contend with far stronger alternatives, and authorities faced a new challenge in regulating them. By the late Middle Ages, Europe's drinking landscape began to change with the spread of distillation. Until then, alcohol had been limited by the strength of fermentation. Ale, cider, and wine rarely rose above moderate potency, and even mead, despite its legendary reputation, was only as strong as yeast could manage. Distillation altered that balance. Stronger, more concentrated spirits emerged, transforming drinking from a constant background habit into something potentially far more dangerous. The earliest distilled drinks were not consumed for pleasure, but for medicine. Apothecaries produced aqua vitae, or water of life, claiming it could preserve youth, cure illness, and extend life. Physicians recommended small doses for ailments ranging from digestive troubles to melancholy. In reality, these early spirits delivered something new, an unmistakable kick that no weak ale could match. Patients may not have been cured, but they certainly felt different. Over time, distilled beverages spread beyond the apothecary's shelf. Monks experimented with them, merchants carried them, and eventually taverns served them. Brandy from wine-growing regions, and later grain-based spirits, offered strength and longevity in storage that no ale could rival. A barrel of spirits could survive long journeys, making it attractive to traders. What had once been a fragile, short-lived drink supply now had a potent, durable companion. This shift worried both clergy and authorities. Strong ale might make a man boisterous. Spirits could knock him flat. Laws and sermons began to adapt, treating distilled drinks as a new moral and social challenge. Some communities embraced them cautiously, while others attempted bans. None of these measures stopped the spread, but they reveal just how disruptive spirits were to a culture accustomed to milder alcohol. Humour slips in when picturing the first reactions. A villager used to sipping small beer all day suddenly encounters a distilled spirit and declares it tastes like fire. A monk prescribes a sip of aqua vitae for health, and then wonders why the patient is singing louder than usual at Vespers. The shock of strength must have been considerable, and it is easy to imagine how quickly people realized this was not a drink to consume by the gallon. Distillation did not replace traditional drinks, but it reshaped the landscape. Ale remained the staple, cider and mead held their places, and wine continued to signify wealth. Yet spirits introduced a new dimension, concentrated strength in smaller doses. They foreshadowed changes that would come to dominate later centuries, when gin, whiskey and brandy became central to European drinking culture. For medieval society, however, the arrival of spirits marked a transition. What had once been a steady rhythm of weak ale and occasional indulgence now had a sharper edge. Drinking was no longer just a background to daily life. It carried new risks and new possibilities. And with that shift, the long history of medieval drinking drew to a close, leaving behind a culture both practical and peculiar, sustained by mugs of ale and shaped by the limits, and later the expansion of what could be brewed and distilled. The arrival of spirits in the later Middle Ages hinted at the future, but the age itself remained defined by ale, wine, cider, and the occasional mead. Taken together, these drinks formed the liquid framework of medieval society. They sustained peasants in the fields, monks in their cloisters, and nobles in their halls. They marked weddings, funerals, harvests, and feast days, just as much as they filled the mugs at breakfast, lunch, and supper. For better or worse, drink was the background to medieval life, so ordinary that people barely thought about it, until it was missing, spoiled, or taxed too heavily. Looking back, the sheer normality of constant drinking can seem strange. A gallon of small beer a day sounds excessive to modern ears, but for medieval villagers it was no more remarkable than bread on the table. Wine, despite its flaws, was a marker of wealth, even when it tasted suspiciously like vinegar. Mead appeared in songs more than in mugs, its reputation burnished by poets who likely exaggerated how often it was poured. And cider and perry carried on quietly in the countryside, satisfying local tastes without ever troubling the records of noble feasts. The system worked not because it was perfect, but because it was practical. Barrels leaked, measures varied, and additives ranged from pleasant to questionable, yet people kept brewing, buying and drinking. Alcohol in medieval times was less about choice than necessity. You didn't ask if you wanted a drink. You asked which drink was still safe enough to swallow. The line between hydration and intoxication was navigated daily, sometimes gracefully, sometimes less so. Humour lingers in the small details. Children drinking weak ale before school. Alewives scolded for short measures while quietly running the most important businesses in town. Monks balancing prayer with production, their robes smelling faintly of malt. Nobles pretending not to notice that their prized imported wine was edging toward vinegar. villagers arguing over whether this year's cider was sweeter than last, only to forget the debate by the bottom of the jug. The medieval drinking world was rarely glamorous, but it was endlessly ordinary, which is precisely why it mattered. What it left behind was not a legacy of fine vintages or legendary brews, but the reminder that drinking was woven into survival. It was fuel, food, ritual, and community all at once. And in that ordinariness lies the real story, not a tale of excess, but a tale of endurance, measured in gallons rather than goblets. And so concludes this particularly long pour of history. You've now heard more about medieval drinking than anyone sensibly needs to know, but this is the Boring Files, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary simply by refusing to end. Thank you for listening. May your own drink, whether water, ale, or something stronger, be fresher than the average medieval barrel.